Welcome back, biology students. And today we are looking at the two main groups of cells, the prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells. So your SOL says you have to be able to compare and contrast the characteristics of the prokaryotic and eukaryotic cell. So that's what we are doing today. And so if you think about this, there are more bacteria in your mouth than there are people on Earth. So take a second and think about that. Think about all the things you have teeming around, teeming in your mouth. And then think of we have 8 billion people on the earth. So there are more than 8 billion bacteria just in your mouth alone. Not all of them are harmful, however, and we'll talk about bacteria later in the year because a lot of people think that bacteria are all harmful, and they're not. Some of them you actually need to help you make vitamins, such as vitamin K, and to help you with proper digestion. And you need like the lactobacillus and some of your gut bacteria that are actually the good bacteria. But bacteria are only one type of cell that we're going to study. They are the prokaryotic cells. So, what are cells? Cells are the basic unit of life. And this is probably our third time seeing that definition. So, make sure it sticks in your mind. In the next few units, we're actually going to be talking about the organelles and the processes that occur in each organelle. So organelles are what we call tiny organs. Basically, they are the little structures within a cell that help your cell do its job, that help the cells perform their functions. There are two main types of cells. There are prokaryotic cells, which do not have a nucleus. They don't have any membrane-bound organelles. So pro means no nucleus, no organelles. And then you means true, and you do have a nucleus. You do have organelles. So it's a true nucleus and true membrane-bound organelles. So comparing the two cells, prokaryotic cells are only the bacteria cells. So that's we have two bacteria kingdoms, archaebacteria and eubacteria. And those two kingdoms of bacteria would fall under the broad term of being prokaryotic cells. Everything else is going to be characterized as a eukaryotic cell. And usually we use the animal cell and the plant cell as the model eukaryotic cells. But don't forget that protists, which are like our algae, those are also eukaryotic, and fungi, which are your mushrooms, and some molds. Those are going to contain eukaryotic cells. So before we get into the difference between the two, let's talk about what all cells have. Both prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells have a cell membrane. They have cytoplasm. They have cytosol. They have ribosomes. And that one can be tricky because a lot of us think that these are organelles. And they are kind of sort of organelles, but they are not what we call membrane-bound organelles. So they do not have a double membrane. Genetic materials such as DNA, and then the ability to reproduce. And in fact, with this one, I would say we could probably add all 8 characteristics of life, because even prokaryotic cells have to have all 8 of those characteristics. They just happen to have all of those 8 characteristics and all of the functions being performed by one cell. Whereas with eukaryotic cells, they have multiple cells. So prokaryotic cells, these were the first cells to inhabit Earth, and these were called the fossil cells. And so these are your bacteria. Again, they were the first living things on Earth. They are simple cells, and they're only made of one single cell. So they are single-celled organisms, or what we call unicellular. They do not have organelles. And it does have DNA, but the DNA is not in a nucleus. The DNA is what we call free floating DNA. So it's just floating out and hanging out in the organism, inside the organism, being suspended by the cytoplasm and being surrounded by the ribosomes. All bacteria have a cell wall, and it depends on the type of bacteria, whether or not the cell wall is made up of a complex chemical called peptidoglycan. And we're going to learn about that when we actually get further into our study of bacteria. So these are some bacterial images. Again, they are very, very, very simple cells and very tiny cells. So if this is an entire bacteria, inside of our bacteria, we would see a single circular chromosome, which is basically the DNA hanging out in the cell. It does not have a nucleus. And then some bacteria actually have what's called a plasmid, and this is a magnified plasmid, and that's an extra circular piece of DNA that can be transferred between bacteria to help them with resistance to chemicals, and so that helps them become resistant to medications. Which is why some medicines don't no longer work against certain bacteria. And so you have to keep switching up your antibiotics. So this actually helps them. It's a advantage for them to exchange plasmids and be able to get that protection from their environment. And so this is a bacteria that causes anthrax, which is a respiratory disease, and as you can see, there's a ton of bacteria in this small field of view. Eukaryotic cells are cells found in plants, animals, protists, and fungi. These are very complex cells. This little prefix U means true. And so you as a human, I just kind of remember you as a human, you as a plant, you as a protist, you as a fungi would be made of eukaryotic cells. They can be single-celled or multi-celled, and this is what trips people up. There are some multicellular fungi, the yeast, that one group, and then some single-celled fungi. There are single-celled protists. All other plants and animals are going to be multi-celled. They do have organelles. They have genetic material in a nucleus, and some have cell walls. That also trips people up because when you see cell walls, fungi have cell walls, but their walls are different from plants. And then plant cell walls and fungi cell walls are different from bacteria cell walls. Some protists also have a cell wall if they are plant-like protists or fungus-like protists. So again, animal cell is representative, and you can see all of these different organelles found within an animal cell. We're going to talk about those in a separate video. And then the plant cell is also representative of the eukaryotic kingdom. Again, all these different organelles. We're going to talk about those in a separate video. And so let's talk about why unicellular organisms are considered living and considered a cell. So some organisms exist as a single cell. So all of the processes, all of the things, the metabolism, the growing, they grow only when they're about to divide for the most part, and they never really develop because they don't mature. But those things, those characteristics of living things have to be present in a single cell organism just as well as multicellular organisms. So the basic processes necessary for living things to survive are the same for a single cell as they are for more complex organisms or multicellular organisms. So a single cell organism has to conduct all life processes by itself, within that one cell. So if you looked at that, one of those images I had of a bacteria, there were tons and tons of little dots. Those are the ribosomes. Those are the proteins. They have tons of proteins that will do all of the jobs that multicellular organism has different cells and different types of cells to do. So whereas single cell organisms have to perform all life functions within one cell, multicellular organisms have different cells that do different jobs, and that's called cell specialization. And so that those cells get organized into tissues and organs and organ systems to help the organism actually function. And so a lot of times, if an organ fails, if your heart fails, then it can definitely impact the entire organism. Okay, so all of these have to work together to be able to support the life of that multicellular organism. All right. So, well, that might not necessarily be the case with like a plant cell. If a plant lost a leaf, it wouldn't necessarily impact or harm the entire tree. But if the entire leaf system was getting too much water, it could impact the entire organism. Okay, so multicellular organisms have different cells that do different jobs, but they each are important for the functioning of the organism. So that ends our discussion on prokaryotes and eukaryotes. Make sure you are able to, or make sure you have a diagram similar to this in your notes, some kind of way to compare and contrast prokaryotes and eukaryotes.